Tonight's topic is going to be more issues, major issues with evolution. This is part 4, the final one in the series. We've had 3 prior parts, and those parts were: number 1, we talked about information, specifically the origin and increase of information. The problem there was, where does information come from? And then once you have some, how do you get more and more over the supposed evolutionary history of almost 4 billion years? Secondly, we talked about natural selection and something called the Cambrian explosion. And then we talked about something called irreducible complexity and excluded middle complexity. That second of which is something I made up, but it was kind of an interesting show. Again, if you haven't seen them, go to the archive page and take a look when you get a chance. Tonight's specific challenge is, how do you go from gray to pink and blue? And what does that mean? Well, specifically it means this. How do you go from a process that takes like a single-celled organism and it just copies itself, to going and having a pink and a blue, having a male and a female that are required to produce offspring, a man and a woman to produce a baby? It's a huge challenge for evolutionists, something that's not really addressed much at all in the literature, and we will be taking a look at that in a fair amount of detail. I've rated this show this evening PG, not for parental guidance so much, but possibly good. I say possibly good because I found out that I kind of bit off more than I could chew with this. This is a huge topic. In the past, when I've chosen topics, sometimes I put it off, but last minute I threw some things together with PowerPoint, and it's always kind of fallen into line, fortunately. This one, the more I looked into it, the more I realized, wow, there's just so much to this, and it's a little challenging explaining it fairly simply. So I say that some material may not be understood by anyone, not because of you, but because of me. I don't know how well I'll explain it, so you gotta bear with me. I'm using you as guinea pigs this evening. So this has actually been called the queen of problems for evolutionary biology. The problem again is, how do you go from what they call asexual reproduction to sexual reproduction? Asexual meaning just single organism, copies itself, to having a male and a female that are required to do this. It's a massive, massive problem, and you'll see why very shortly here. Here's a quote from Graham Bell, not Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, but Graham Bell, a British evolutionist. He said, "Sex is the queen of problems in evolutionary biology. Perhaps no other natural phenomena has aroused so much interest. Certainly none has sowed as much confusion. The insights of Darwin and Mendel, which have illuminated so many mysteries, have so far failed to shed more than a dim and wavering light on the central mystery of sexuality, emphasizing its obscurity by its very isolation." And then we have Carl Zimmer. He's a popular science writer from Yale University's Morse College. He said, "Sex is not only unnecessary, but it ought to be a recipe for evolutionary disaster. For one thing, it is an inefficient way to reproduce, and sex carries other costs as well. By all rights, any group of animals that evolve sexual reproduction should be promptly outcompeted by non-sexual ones, and yet sex reigns. Why is sex a success despite all its disadvantages?" Very good question. And just one other side note here. As we discuss this, we're going to be discussing it in a very kind of generic sense. We're not getting into the morality of sexual activity, none of that at all. Again, it'll be even appropriate for younger audiences. We're going to be looking at more of the biological and evolutionary challenges to this whole thing. We have Richard Dawkins. I've talked about him quite a bit in previous shows. He's arguably the world's most famous atheist, very outspoken evolutionist. Way back in 1986, in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, he said, "For reasons that I haven't the space to go into, the origin of sexual reproduction poses a big theoretical puzzle for Darwinians." So he's admitting a long time ago this is a huge problem. Then fast forward 10 years later, in his book, Climbing Mount Improbable, he said, "There are many theories of why sex exists, and none of them is knocked down convincing. Maybe one day I'll summon up the courage to tackle it in full and write a whole book on the origin of sex." Well, that was 10 years later. It didn't happen. And actually, to date, it still hasn't happened. Fast forward another 10 years, 2006, the 30th anniversary edition of the Selfish Gene that he wrote, said if sexual, as opposed to non-sexual, reproduction benefits a gene for sexual reproduction, That is sufficient explanation for the existence of sexual reproduction. I'll comment on that more in a second. He goes on to say, this comes perilously close to being a circular argument. Nevertheless, I believe there are ways of escaping from the circularity, but this book is not the place to pursue the question. Oh, he's putting it off again. He keeps saying, this is an issue here, but this isn't the place, some other time. Well, he never got around to really addressing it. But what he said in this quote was, the fact that sexual reproduction carries with it some advantages is enough of an explanation as to why it happened, how it actually evolved. Well, that actually doesn't make any sense. It's kind of like talking about being a multi-billionaire. Let's just say, for instance, argument's sake, that I am a multi-billionaire. And someone says, wow, how did you become a multi-billionaire? And I say, well, there are so many advantages to becoming a billionaire. I got all this money, I can pay any bill, I can buy whatever I want, I can help out charities, I can do lots of stuff, a lot of advantages to it. And the person would say, well, yeah, I understand that, but how did you become a billionaire? How did you get all that money? And I would say, like I told you, there are so many advantages to being a billionaire. It's like, that doesn't explain how you became a billionaire. So simply addressing why there are some advantages to sexual reproduction doesn't explain how it actually got here to begin with, but that's about all you're going to see in the literature. So, how do we go from single-celled organisms that literally copy themselves to going to other creatures, the eukaryotic creatures? The prokaryotic creatures are the single-celled creatures. Eukaryotic creatures are creatures that have multiple cells, whether they're plants or animals and things. These creatures all require a male and a female to reproduce. So how do you make that transition? It is a huge, huge challenge. Now, last month we talked about metamorphosis, the absolutely miraculous process of taking something like a caterpillar and turning it all the way into a butterfly. And one of the points that I made in discussing that was this: you can't just have a caterpillar evolve into one butterfly. You need a pink and a blue one. You need a male and a female to be able to mate to produce more butterflies. So if that caterpillar somehow miraculously, on its own, through evolutionary history, came out as a butterfly and it's just sitting there looking around thinking, I don't know what to do next, there are no other butterflies around to reproduce with. So you have to produce that male and female, and from that point on out, it has to happen over and over and over. But that's a huge, huge challenge. And there are two categories of problems with this challenge. The first one is, how does this happen the first time? So in evolutionary history, they say 3.8 billion years ago, dead chemicals came together to form that first living cell, which could itself copy itself. Because if the first living cell couldn't copy itself, it's not going anywhere, it's done. It doesn't even help you. So that first cell had to be able to copy itself and copy and copy and copy. So how do you go from that process where you're just copying that single cell, and it turns out to be the same thing every time, to a process where now you have a male and a female that each have half of the required information, and they happen to be in the same place at the same time and like each other and get together in the right way so that they can combine the information to produce offspring like themselves, which would also have to produce males and females, on and on and on. That's a huge problem. How do you do that the first time? Second category is, how do you do it all the other times? Because there are millions of species of creatures on this planet, and each time you produce a new species, you have to produce males and females. Because if you just do one, you're not going anywhere. If you just do all males, you're not going anywhere. Just all females, you're not going anywhere. You've got to have both male and female every time you do a new species. This is a huge, huge problem, which we'll be talking about in this program. And we have two processes that go on when things reproduce. We've got mitosis and meiosis. Mitosis is a process that is used to copy those single-cell organisms, the prokaryotes. It is also a process that's used to copy what we call somatic cells in our body. Skin cells, cells in your eyes, your hair, and all that. And when your skin's wearing out, your body makes more skin cells constantly. It's doing it all the time, your whole life. This process of mitosis is involved in reproducing those cells, and we'll see that in detail in a second. And then we have meiosis, which is a process that's very different that creates what we call gametes. These are special things that can get together to produce offspring like a baby. They take some specialized germ cells and they turn them into gametes. In your body, the cells have DNA in the nucleus, and the DNA has information to make up your whole body. It can make heart cells, it can make liver cells, it can make spleen cells and all those things, but it differentiates and it specializes each time. So the cells on the tip of your finger just make skin cells there, but the cells in your eyes make eye cells. They kind of know what to do as they duplicate. And that's this process of mitosis doing that. But then meiosis takes special cells that are saved called germ cells, and it undergoes this special process of meiosis to make these gametes, which are the things that are going to be in the males and the females that have to come together to continue offspring, a male and female, a mom and a dad, to make a baby. So let's start out talking about the first process, mitosis. That copies single-celled organisms, and it also copies the other somatic cells in our body. Now in the cell, in the nucleus, in the middle there, that's where you've got your DNA. In this particular diagram, there's little X's in the middle there, what we call chromosomes. Normally the DNA is in the middle. It's not forming the X's, they're just kind of sitting as loose strands. So when we do mitosis, we've actually got to duplicate our DNA to begin with. So you normally have 46 of these strands sitting in the nucleus. Well, 23 came from your mom and 23 came from your dad. So there's 46 single strands, 23 from mom, 23 from dad. They do come together as chromosomes. So string 1 from your dad gets together with string 1 from your mom and makes chromosome 1. Then string 2 lines up with string 2. So you got 23 of these pairs in the nucleus, half from your mom, half from your dad. Well, we got to duplicate this whole thing. We got to make copies. So we make copies of dad's strings. We make copies of mom's strings. So now we have 23 X's, double strings from dad, 23 X's, double strings from mom. We've just duplicated the DNA in the nucleus there. It is not a simple process. It is unbelievably complex. We are not going to go through this diagram right now. That would be a different show for another time, but I don't want you to just think because I copied this in my PowerPoint, it's pretty simple. It is incredibly, incredibly complex. Another barrier for evolution, but that's another show for another time. Now, that single cell in our body there, inside the nucleus is all the DNA. If you could reach into just one of those cells in your body, you got about 100 trillion cells, reach into just one of those cells and pull out all the DNA, it would be so long, it would be about 6 feet long out of this tiny microscopic cell. Now, what's interesting is if you were to expand this cell to be the size of a basketball, now the DNA, which was about 6 feet long and super, super thin, now it's about the thickness of a fishing line there, and it's 125 miles long. So picture holding a basketball. You reach inside to pull out the DNA and you pull it out, and it's 125 miles long. And when the cells copy, they have to pull out that DNA and unwind it, make a copy, then wind it back up and get it back in that basketball. That's an incredibly complex process, which just can't happen by accident over millions of years, but that just kind of gives you an appreciation for what's going on there. So if you took the DNA out of every cell in your body and lined it up end to end, you'd be dead. So don't do that. But if you were able to do that, it would actually reach from the earth to the sun over 1,200 times, about 1,222 times by my calculations. Each cell is about 6 feet of DNA. You got about 100 trillion cells. You do the math. You span that distance about 93 million miles over 1,200 times. It is phenomenal. So back to our cell. Now we've got 23 blue X's and 23 pink X's from mom and dad. We've doubled the DNA inside that cell. Then what happens is there was a membrane around that breaks down, and now these X's start to float towards the middle, and there are these microtubules that come out to connect with them to help them line up in the middle of the cell there, up and down, and there are these pink and blue X's lining up and down in the middle of that cell because of these microtubules. They pull to straighten them up, to line them up, and then what happens is they start to get pulled apart. There are these little spooling mechanisms, these motors that start to yank these things apart, take up the slack in these microtubules to actually pull the DNA in half. And then when you got them separated to the sides of the cell, you got some new membranes forming around the new 2 separate sets of DNA. And you have a process called cytokinesis that goes and starts to divide that cell in two. So then you end up with two completely separate cells. And from beginning to end, we took that original cell there and we made two copies, two basically identical copies. Now we know mutations go on. We're not covering that in this talk. I've talked about that a little bit in the past. But basically, it's a duplication of that cell. That's what mitosis does. That's how the process works. Now we're going to take a look at meiosis, the process that makes the gametes, what we call the sex cells, germ cells, turned into gametes, which then are necessary for mom and dad to use to make a baby. It's a much more complex process. We start out with the same cell. This is going to be a germ cell, but it's got the 46 strings in there, 23 from mom, 23 from dad. We have to duplicate that DNA. So we've got the duplication here. Now we have 23 X's from dad, 23 X's from mom, just like that initial process when we were initially talking about mitosis, but now we're talking about meiosis, and something different happens. We start to get the lineup in the middle of those chromosomes, but instead of it being two single strands next to each other, we actually have two X's next to each other. We have dad's X and mom's X, number one, next to each other, and they have dad's X2 and mom's X2 next to each other. And when they line up, something interesting happens. So they're next to each other, moms and dads. Then they start to cross over with each other. When they do, they exchange genetic information. So they end up with kind of a mixture. One of them is mainly dads, but it's got a little bit of moms in it. The other one's mainly moms, but it's got a little bit of dads in it. So that's what happens when these chromosome X's are in the middle there, and then they start to get yanked apart back to their sides, left and right. And you can see in this particular diagram, as they're being pulled apart, these X's, there's a little bit of red on the tip of the blue, there's a little bit of blue on the tip of the red because that genetic information has mixed. So they get pulled off to the side, membranes start to form around that DNA as well, and it starts to split into two cells. The one cell splits into two, and they both have a full complement, of the DNA, which is kind of a mixture there. And then from this point, these two cells that were produced are going to undergo something that's just like the mitosis. These two cells are going to split into two more cells, and it's a similar process now. They start to get yanked apart, single strands, just like the mitosis thing, and then we end up with basically four cells. The graphics that I was using didn't have a final one with four totally separate cells, but you can see they're starting to separate. Each one of these four cells now has half the original genetic information that original cell has. That's these gametes, which are going to be necessary then for sexual reproduction. So the female provides half the genetic information, and the male provides half the genetic information. And each one of these four cells is unique because there was a mixing going on. So each one is unique. So whichever one actually gets used in fertilization, that'll really drive the genetics of the offspring. It's very interesting, very complex. I'm actually skipping a lot of details. So how do we go from that mitosis process that produces just an identical copy to meiosis, where you produce four cells, each is unique and each only has half of the genetic information? You have to do that in order to have sexual reproduction. It has to be exactly half. You can't have 2/3 and 1/3 because the chromosomes can't match up. You cannot have offspring with that. And you can't do this a little bit at a time. This whole thing we just looked at, and a lot of details I skipped, all has to happen the very first time, or you don't have reproduction and evolution can't continue. It all has to happen the very first time and every time after that. We also have another problem. We have a delivery system problem. Even if we have half the genetic information in something we call a male now and something we call a female, she's got half. How do you get the two together? We have a delivery challenge as well. We'll take a look at that. So talking about delivery, we've got a pink egg here and we got a blue for the male side. We know what's going on here, keeping it simple, wink, wink. So you need the pink and the blue to come together, each with half the information to make a baby. There are a lot of challenges to the delivery going on here. It's very, very interesting. So each has half that genetic information and we need to get those two together. Well, there are some barriers, one of which is that the female egg does have a barrier around it that's hard for Mr. Blue Guy here to get through. but he actually has something inside him that can actually break down this barrier and actually use the components of that wall for energy for his journey on into the eggs. Very interesting. That has to be there for him to get through, and it's got to be there right away, or we're not going to have a baby. But once he gets into this environment, it's very toxic. It's very acidic. That would not be a good place for him to be. However, he has something that can neutralize the acid there. Isn't that kind of cool? All that just supposedly happened by accident the very first time. Then we have something else going on here. We have the female's immune system. The way our immune systems work is our cells, in a sense, have tags on them where we recognize our own cells. But something foreign comes in and says, hey, that isn't us, let's destroy it. White blood cells come out and they work to get rid of these foreigners. Well, Mr. Blue comes along here, he's got a name tag that says, hey, my name is Ernie. And she says, hey, that ain't us, let's get rid of this guy. Well, if she actually went through with that, we wouldn't have fertilization, you wouldn't have a baby. Well, Mr. Ernie here actually carries something with him to suppress her local immune system. That just happened by accident the very first time. Well, that's good for him to suppress her immune system locally, but that would be bad if he suppressed her whole immune system, because she could get very sick, could even die. But he just does it locally to allow him to get into that local environment. But that's also bad for her, because there are other bacteria in the area. A lot of bacteria is good, but we've got some bad bacteria too. How is she going to fight this bacteria now, because he just knocked out her immune system? Well, he carries with him his own little local immune system and can fight those bad bacteria, so he's doing her a favor so he can kind of move forward with this process that needs to take place to have a baby. And all that has to be there. And again, we're skipping a bunch of detail here. Then once he's on his journey here, you need baking instructions and a baker. So here's an analogy. Let's say you call up a friend and say, hey, let's get together and make a cake. And you can notice here by looking closely, there's a lot of chocolate going on here. Don't give me the fruit cakes here, won't eat it, but chocolate. If it doesn't have chocolate, it's not dessert. I think it says that in the Bible somewhere towards the back. You can quote me on that somehow. But let's say you do get together to make the cake, and you each bring half of the ingredients. So now you're in the kitchen with the ingredients there, and you're staring at each other like, how come there's no cake? It's like, I don't know, I brought my half. And the other person says, well, I brought my half. How come we don't have a cake? Well, maybe we need to get the stuff together here. So you push the ingredients together, and you're still staring at each other, still no cake. It's not just about having the ingredients. There's something key missing here, and that is the baking instructions. You need to know what to take first, where to put it, for how long, all these things. And you need someone who can read the instructions and carry them out. Well, how's that going to happen by accident in nature? All of those things need to be there. So this whole problem of the origin of sexual reproduction, where there is a male and a female each having half the information and having a delivery system and getting there, the right place at the right time with instructions of how all that works, that's not going to happen by accident. Yet it must have happened the very first time, had to be successful, and then every time after that to produce all these species. There's kind of a ringing silence in the scientific literature about this. Occasionally they'll say, yeah, this is kind of a challenge. They generally don't address it. When they do, and they say, well, we've got the solution, they tend to just talk about why there's an advantage of having a pink and a blue, a male and a female, and all those things. And yes, there are advantages. We're not going to go on to the details here genetically why it might be an advantage. There are disadvantages too. But just because there are advantages doesn't explain how that process actually occurred. How did it go from the single-celled thing just copying itself to having the pink and the blue and the half and half and all that? It's not an explanation at all. Now, there's a great resource that just came out, I think actually just this month. It's a book called Darwin's Secret Sex Problem, very provocative title. The subtitle was Exposing Evolution's Fatal Flaw, The Origin of Sex by F. LaGard Smith. I actually got a copy of the book. I contacted them. They gave me a promo copy. They overnighted it to me. I was very thankful for that. I'm about 2/3 of the way through the book. The timing was great, though, because I decided for this month I would do this topic. Someone else came along and said, hey, if you ever need someone to do research for you, I'd love to help you out. And I said, you know what? Two things you can start to do research for me. One would be Metamorphosis. I know how it works. I know what the challenges are, but I'm not that familiar with what all the evolutionists are saying. What's their explanation? How does this work? They're pretty quiet too. So look into that to find out, give you some specific quotes. And the other one was the origin of pink and blue, sexual reproduction. I know what the problems are, but what are they really saying in their literature? I just haven't had time to really look into that. So he said, okay, well, 2 days later, I got an email about this book, ordered the book, told him he didn't need to do the research. It's been done. So I'm 2/3 of the way through this. Excellent book. The author's got a great sense of humor as well, but he's done a lot of work doing a lot of research on this, and I'm looking forward to reading the last third. I think it's going to be just a great resource. We are going to produce a DVD in the future. A lot of details about creation evolution. I'm going to elucidate this in more detail in that DVD, but I was appreciative that he's done a lot of the heavy lifting looking into the scientific literature. And that was his conclusion, that it's just basically dead silence with the occasional nodding like, yeah, this is a challenge. And then they talk about the benefits, but they don't say this is really how it theoretically could have occurred, because they just can't even think about how, they can't even imagine how this would have happened. And I can't either. I'd love to hear them explain it rather than just saying, well, maybe someday we'll tackle this issue. Well, they've known about this type of a problem for probably 100 years, and they still don't have a clue as to how this is happening. So that wraps up the program for this particular month. We are going to head right now into our Q&A, take the short break like we normally do. We're going to be addressing your questions, so hang in there. We'll see you in just a minute. We are back, and we're going to be taking a look at your questions. We got a lot of questions over the month. We can't always answer all of them, but we look forward to this time because so many questions come in, and they are really good questions, and this is my favorite part because it allows me to know the things that you're wondering about. So, first question we will take a look at for this evening comes from Robert in Canada. Why did men live so long before the flood? And just again, as a side note, the questions you submit don't necessarily have to be on the particular topic we're covering this evening. And if we only did that, there'd be so many other questions we'd never get to. So we don't mind answering questions from different topics. This is a great one. The Bible certainly does indicate that men lived much longer prior to the flood. Adam 930 years, Noah 950 years, Methuselah 969 years. Today we live, 80, 90 years or so. So why did they live so long before the flood? Some people think, well, the atmosphere was very different then, and it was a better atmosphere, and then after the flood, it changed quite a bit, and then they couldn't live as long. Well, it's really not the best response. One reason is that Noah, his wife, and the sons and their wives came off the ark and lived for hundreds of years after that. So if it was just the environment, they would have passed away shortly after that as well, but they lived for quite a long time. People that were born subsequently to that, their ages started to decline. So most likely it seems that God himself did something with our genetics to make that change. Sure, there were environmental factors as well. Probably had more harmful radiation coming in after the flood. There's a lot to that. Also, population bottleneck. We went from having a lot of people prior to the flood to having a small population of 8, and even more so 6, because Noah and his wife didn't have children after the flood, but the 3 sons and the 3 wives did. So they're repopulating the whole earth. So a smaller genetic pool also causes some genetic issues and could lead to some shorter lifespan and a bunch of other things going on. Prior to the flood, it could be that God had done something different with our genetics. Our lifespans seem to be somewhat limited by something called telomeres, which are little stringy things on the end of our chromosomes every time a cell reproduces, and we just talked about all that cell reproduction. Every time they do copy themselves, these telomeres kind of get chopped off, and they can only get chopped off so many times, and then they're done reproducing, which is a good thing. Otherwise, they would continue to accumulate all these mutations, and they'd be copied more and more and more. We wouldn't be able to survive. So it was kind of a brilliant thing for God to build that in where they only copy so many times. Prior to the flood, they were probably copying more than they do today, allowed them to live longer. After the flood, things were a little bit different. There's a lot more to it than that, but there's no reason that they couldn't have lived longer before the flood. The Bible is very clear that they did, but God says after that, I'm going to limit the age of mankind, and now we live 80, 90 years or so. So interesting question, a lot more to that context if you want a little bit more of the detail to that. Next question is Tommy in Florida. Could you debunk or confirm carbon dating? Another great question. We've touched on that in some of our past episodes. This is important because it's such a common question. So many Christians wonder about carbon-14 dating. So many evolutionists and skeptics use it to say that the Bible is not true, the creation account is not accurate. And it typically works something like this. Skeptic may say to the Christian, do you really believe all that Bible stuff? The Christian says, well, yeah, I guess so. And then the skeptic says, what about carbon-14 dating? The Christian might say, well, I don't know that much about carbon-14 dating, I just believe the Bible. The skeptic says, yeah, you have your nice little fairy tale there, but I live in the real world. We deal with science and proving things, and then they walk off. And the Christian is left kind of embarrassed and humiliated. They may even be thinking, I'm not going to share my faith anymore because I don't have answers. I kind of wonder about it. So here's the situation. Anyone who would say that carbon-14 dating disproves the Bible, disproves the creation account, proves the earth is billions of years old, anything like that, the only thing that proves is that person doesn't really understand carbon-14 dating at all. And here's why. I'm going to keep it kind of simple. I'm going to keep it kind of short because we have covered it a little bit in the past, and there is a lot to this. But one thing is, there's not a scientist on the planet who uses carbon-14 to date something that they think is probably very old. They never use it to date something that they think, according to their evolutionary theory, might be 200,000 years old, 5 million years old, 1 billion years old. The reason why is carbon-14 decays at such a rate that it only lasts a few tens of thousands of years, and after that it's completely gone. So if they have a bone that they think should be, let's say 65 million years old, is a dinosaur bone, dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago, if they think it's a dinosaur bone, then they are thinking it's at least 65 million years old, so it can't have any carbon-14 in it, so you can't use carbon-14 dating on it. That's their mindset. So they would never use that method to date something that they think is old. Now what's interesting is we actually find carbon-14 in dinosaur bones and soft tissue and red blood cells and even DNA. We covered that in one of the past episodes. So it shouldn't be there according to them, but that it actually is. The second category of issues with carbon-14 is you can't date rocks with it. Carbon-14 is only used to date things that were once living because the sunlight that comes into our atmosphere creates carbon-14 in the air, bangs into nitrogen-14, converts that into carbon-14. I'll skip some of those details. Carbon-14 is created by the sun. It's radioactive. It wants to decay back into nitrogen-14. And then it combines with oxygen while it's in the atmosphere to give you carbon dioxide. Well, plants take in carbon dioxide. It's their food, photosynthesis. Take it in. So now this carbon-14 that was created by the sun in the air we breathe gets into the plants. And then the animals eat the plants. So now carbon-14 gets into plants and the animals. Well, then we eat the plants. We eat the animals. So carbon-14 gets into us. So it really gets into all living things. Once you eat food and you bring it in, it decays away. But then you eat some more and bring some more in. So your entire life, you're bringing it into your body and it's going away. When you die or something dies, it stops eating. So whatever carbon-14 it had is going to decay away, but now it's not going to be replaced anymore. So it's going to get less and less and less. So the scientists dig up a bone, they figure out how much carbon-14 is left in this thing, meaning how long ago did this thing stop eating? Meaning how long ago did it die? Meaning about how old is it? That's how they use the method, but it only works on things that were once living. So, kind of wrapping this up, carbon-14 dating can't be used to date things that are, hundreds of thousands or millions or billions of years old. You can't date rocks with it. It can be used fairly accurately if you understand all the different factors that go into it. If you ignore them or don't understand them, you can come up with dates that are incorrect. 30,000 years, 40,000, 50,000 years. There are a number of reasons why those dates are not correct, and sometimes they contradict each other. It's because of these factors. Typically, when they take one of those older dates and take the factors into account, they get corrected down into a range of 4,500, 5,000 years, which would line up more closely with the biblical flood, which was roughly 4,500 years ago. So we don't want to say carbon-14 dating is just bunk and it's totally wrong, and we don't want to say it's rocket, science. It's clear-cut, black and white. It's always right. It's kind of in between. It can be used accurately, but you got to understand it and use it carefully. But good question. Again, we may cover that more detail again in the future. Next question, Ron, our good buddy in California. Does the rate of salinization in the oceans and their current salinity comport with the claim of a 5 billion year old Earth? Good question. Interesting question. This has to do with the amount of salt that's in the ocean. Now, very quickly, I've mentioned it in the past, but there are no clocks in nature. None. Now people say, wait a minute, we got all that radiometric dating and carbon-14 dating that we just talked about. No, there are no clocks in nature. What we do see in nature are processes, things that are occurring. And by making certain assumptions about these processes, you can turn them into a clock. One example of a process is the fact that there is salt or sodium being washed into the oceans. That's a real process going on today. It's not in and of itself a clock, it is a process. But if you make certain assumptions about that process, you could turn it into a clock. If you assume that the rate that we see salt going into the oceans today is the rate that it's always gone into the oceans, you could try to calculate how much salt is in the oceans today, how fast has it been going in, assuming, let's say, the ocean started with no salt and then it went to the salt level we have today, make a bunch of assumptions, and you could turn it into a clock. When you do that, and I think if I remember this correctly, let's assume that when the oceans formed to begin with, they didn't have any salt in it. And let's assume that the rate that salt has been entering the oceans is the same rate that we observe today. Now, we don't know what the rate was 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or 1,000,000 years ago, or 1,000,000,000 years ago. We weren't around to see that. But if we assume it's always been at the rate we see today, and it started out at 0, I think you calculate an age for the oceans of about 62 million years. Well, that's a long time. That's an old ocean. What's the issue with that? The issue is, according to evolutionists, the Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago. And then our oceans formed within the few million years after that. So the oceans should be a few billion years old. But according to this clock, in a sense, this process, it says, no, they're only 62 million years old. Now, 62 million years is a long time, but it's nowhere near what it should be if the Big Bang and evolution is true. So here's a single process that says there's no way it could be billions of years old. Now, it's one process. A single process doesn't prove anything because there are all these assumptions here. I don't think those are good assumptions to assume that the ocean had no salt to begin with and it's always been going at that rate. When you take into account something like the flood would have totally disrupted everything. So I don't think it's a valid assumption to say it's always been at the rate we observe today. But even if you give them that, let's say it's always been constant at the same rate, you're still only coming up with 62 million years, and they need a lot more time. What we do in general is we look at a process like this, and we look at all the processes. There are over 100 processes, physical processes in nature, that you have to make assumptions about to turn them into a clock. But if you take all those processes and make the assumptions they like to make, constant rates, whatever we observe today, that's the way it's always been. That's called uniformitarianism. Uniform processes, always the same rate. I don't think that's a good assumption. Most geologists today say, we used to kind of think that, but it doesn't look like that. It looks like there's catastrophic stuff going on. But even if you give them the uniform rates, 90% of all the processes we could look at yield ages that are far too young for a 4.5 billion year old Earth or a 13.8 billion year old universe. So looking at all the processes, you should conclude that things are relatively young and you don't have time for evolution and the Big Bang. But they ignore those because it doesn't fit with their story, what they want it to be. They'll look at just a handful of things that come up with billions of years and say, see, that proves what we believe. So here's a good example. The salt in the oceans. No, it doesn't fit well at all with secular ideas, but it actually could fit more with a biblical narrative because we wouldn't have uniform rates of sodium going into the ocean because, as I didn't explain before, rain comes down on the land, washes elements and things into the oceans, including sodium. So it gets washed into the ocean and then the water evaporates, leaving the sodium in the ocean, comes down on the land and washes more sodium into the oceans and evaporates. It just keeps bringing more and more sodium into the oceans. So the oceans are getting saltier, but it fits in a lot better with a younger Earth and a worldwide flood than it does with something like a Big Bang. So that's just kind of one way of looking at this, but great question. Next question, Tom, who is from our local audience here. It's always awesome having people here who are actually sitting in live. Why did evolution become and remain popular starting in Darwin's time? Great broad question here, and it leads to another issue. A lot of people think that Darwin is the one who invented the idea of evolution. No, not at all. The idea had been around a long time. Some people think he even plagiarized his grandfather. It had been around back to the time of the Greeks and even prior to that. What Darwin did in 1859 when he published The Origin of Species is he made it very popular and he made it seem plausible academically and scientifically. Prior to that, people who wanted to reject God and reject creation and reject the Bible, they didn't really have a good academic defense for it. But yet they still did reject God and the Bible. They just said, well, they thought things must have happened on their own naturally over long periods of time. Darwin came out and seemed to give credibility from an academic standpoint. Now, he didn't really actually do that, but it certainly seemed to appear that way. He knew nothing about the inner workings of the cell and DNA and all that. He just thought the cell was like some gel or whatever kind of goop, and it seemed pretty simple that it could just kind of copy and get more complex over time. But a lot of people jumped on that at that time because they were looking for an excuse to reject the Bible. Now they thought they had an academic one. So it started to catch on more and more. And even many people within the church said, wow, these scientists are proving a different story other than the creation account. You have to believe that because, hey, they're working with science and science is black and white and you can't argue with it. So it gained more and more popularity. And then what happened in this country, for most of our history, we were just teaching creation. We were teaching out of the Bible. We would use it to teach spelling, grammar, morality, history, creation. But then people were saying, well, that's not fair to only be presenting one view. You can't do that. So then there was a big switch to only teaching one view, but now it's only teaching evolution. So now in our public school systems and state universities, they're only presenting one view. It's evolution. And for a while, they were trying to get creation taught back in the school systems, but now, hey, you can't do that. Separation of church and state, that's a religious concept. You can't do that. Evolution is science. Then further down the line, they said, hey, can we at least present intelligent design science? Intelligent design is all about looking at scientific evidences that things appear to be designed. Their goal isn't to teach the Bible, to teach about Jesus or God or creation or Genesis. They're just saying scientifically there's evidence that things did not come together accidentally. There's design there. But they're told, no, you can't present that because that implies a designer. And a designer is a religious concept and you can't have that in a school system. So then some people said, okay, if you can't teach creation and you can't teach intelligent design, can we at least let the students know there are some pretty significant problems with the idea of evolution? And they're largely being told, no, you can't do that. Because if the students find out that there are problems with the idea of evolution, they may doubt it. And if they doubt it, they may be open to the idea of design, and that's a religious concept and can't have that in the school system. So it's kind of frustrating, and the students are being told, we've checked that out. There's only one game in town scientifically, and that's evolution. If we ever discover something else, we'll let you know, but for now, it's evolution. And when you're only presenting one view, it's going to sound pretty plausible, rather than having multiple competing views, and you could use critical thinking skills. We don't really have that going on in the school systems today. So that's what Darwin did. He didn't invent evolution. He just made it sound very popular. But the more we've looked at his ideas, even using his own words, we found out it just doesn't really cut it. We're building up more and more evidence saying that his idea just does not work. It's not plausible at all scientifically. And more scientists are coming on board saying, yeah, we're starting to see these major issues with evolution. So with that, our next broadcast again is going to be in September, taking the summer off. Again, sign up for our newsletter if you're not on the list already. You can do it right from the website there. Scroll down, click on it, fill out some information, and then you'll be kept up to date to when our next broadcast is going to be. And again, we're going to be covering a series, Icons of Evolution, including that progression of apes to men, pictures we see in the textbooks all the time, that, and a bunch of other examples, these classic evidences for evolution. We'll take that in our series September, October, and November. So we appreciate you guys being with us, and we hope you guys have a great summer. If you have any questions in the meantime, contact us through our website. We'd love to help you. God bless.